Great, thanks. So yeah, today we're going to spend about 10-15 minutes looking at Gatsby. If you've never heard of Gatsby before, don't worry, we're going to cover the background before diving in, opening up VS Code and actually having a look at the files that make up a Gatsby site. So before we get too far into it, I just want to introduce myself. If you don't know me, my name is John Kilmister and I'm a software architect. However, kind of more relevant to this is that I've been working in front-end websites for about 15 years or so, and more recently in Gatsby. We're going to cover what is Gatsby and why it matters. We're then going to show you what you need to do to get up and running, and then we're going to have a look inside a Gatsby site at all the files that it makes up. So let's start at the beginning. And what is Gatsby or Gatsby.js, and why does it matter? And we're going to do this through a definition. Gatsby is many things, so let's break it down. Starting with the first bit. Gatsby is an open source static site generator. And this is the thing that sets it apart from things, say, like Angular or other JavaScript frameworks. But we need to first of all have a look at what is a static site generator. Gatsby isn't the only one, but static site generators are different than your traditional web model or something like Angular or another JavaScript framework. So to do this, we're going to do a bit of a comparison on web application models. So in a traditional app, say an ASP.NET or a PHP app, you would do a small amount of work at build time. In .NET world, that's turning it into the intermediate language and various other bits and pieces. Then your client is going to request a web page. And this is where most of the work is done on the web server. You'll go away to databases, third-party APIs, and various other bits and pieces. And you have to do quite a bit of caching because this process can be slow. And eventually, it goes back to the client, and we'll just top it off with a little bit of extra JavaScript to give it a bit of functionality. The world moved on, and we moved into the world of JavaScript frameworks, or SPAs. So these are things like Angular, Vue.js, and React. And in that world, the build was a transpilation, or is a transpilation, and a little bit of configuration. And when the client requests a file from the web server, they're just picking up a JavaScript file. That then goes back. But at this point, we're missing some of the content. So further APIs are required to go back to the server, grab the extra little bit, and then we have a full page. And where this can be problematic is on a slow mobile device. You have to pull down a large framework, you end up with a white page, and then you have to go and make those additional API requests. It also, if you don't have server-side rendering kind of managed, it can be bad for SEO as well, because things like Google, it requires a second pass in order to run the JavaScript. And that's where we enter in this relatively new class of applications, static site generators. Gatsby or Gatsby.js is one of those, but there's things like Hugo and Next that are also available. And the way they work is that at build time, we're generating HTML files. So it's a node application that will go off to your databases, go off to your third-party APIs. Doing all that work that we saw in the traditional app done on the page request is actually done at build time. Then when your user requests a page, they're getting back a static HTML file. And this has all of the content in and everything. So it's super fast. And then finally, that's returned back to the client browser. And some JavaScript is executed at that time, but the majority of the content is already there in the page. And that's great for SEO, it's great for performance, and those pages are optimized just with what's needed to render the page. We do have some other considerations though, because if we're generating everything at build time, how are things going to work? So the JavaScript file, as I say, at build time becomes HTML, which goes off to the client. But we've got the problem that if I've got my website in 3 different languages, how's that going to work? In a sort of SPA app, we'd go back and get the content. So you change the language to French, we'd make another API call and go and get the French content. Well, in this point, you can't do it. So at build time, we actually have to create every permutation of your site. So if you have a different menu for logged in, logged out, we actually have to generate 2 sets of HTML files. Or if we've got 3 different languages, you have to generate 3 different HTML files. Now, having hundreds of HTML files stored on a web server is cheap. And as far as the user is concerned, this is the fastest way to get the alternate version of your site. But there are some other considerations. What happens when data in your database changes? Or you make a configuration change? Or you change a feature flag? Well, all of these require you to rebuild your website. Now, that might sound really dramatic, and you think, well, my build, it's a back-end dev process. But these builds are relatively fast, and we have to start thinking about things when working static site generation in a different way. Your build process now actually becomes part of your production infrastructure, and we need to make sure that it's maintained and kept up to date and is very performant in order to deliver this. But because we're doing all of these kind of changes and rebuilding the files offline, we don't have to worry about a user getting a cold version of the page and having to go and get fresh content from the database and then recache it before presenting it. So all these things are done offline. So that's what static site generator is, and that's the thing that really sets Gatsby apart from things like Angular or React on its own. But Gatsby is more than just that. It is based on React.js. So if you're already familiar with React, you can dive just straight in and get started with Gatsby. And why is this important? Well, in the State of the JS survey recently in 2020, you can see here that React was used by 80% of projects. So it's super popular, and you're going to find loads of resources to get you up and running. But as well as being based on React, it's also an opinionated React framework. So React gives, if you're not familiar with it, it gives you lots of flexibility. You can pull in different routing engines, you can pull in different data stores and various other bits and pieces. But Gatsby is set up that out of the box, you get certain things pre-configured. The next thing that Gatsby is backed by GraphQL, and this makes it super powerful. If you're not familiar with GraphQL, it's a query language that sits on top of your data source. So these pages that we build up in the build process, they need to get data from somewhere, backend databases, third-party APIs, and various other places. And the way that Gatsby deals with this is that each page looks that data up in the graph, and you can push in new queries into that graph in order to do that. And again, GraphQL is a really popular technology that's growing and growing. So in essence, that's what Gatsby is, but it's also much more. You can do TypeScript with it, so you can do React TypeScript files. It's based on Node, as I've mentioned, so it also has NPM, so you can pull in all your favorite Node modules. And it's based on Webpack. So all of this together makes it more secure, because the majority of the access to the APIs and the databases are done at build time on your private servers rather than at runtime. It's accessible because the pages that the client pulls down are just plain HTML. So they're there ready to be read by screen readers, SEO, and various other bits and pieces. It's highly scalable. You're just serving HTML files and JavaScript files, and you can do that over a CDN. And for the same reason that it's scalable, it's also very performant, because we're not having to, at runtime, go off and call extra third-party services. It's also extremely popular. It's got nearly 50,000 stars on GitHub, and is, according to their own website, is the fastest growing framework. So that kind of covers what Gatsby is, but what do you need to do to get up and running? So as I mentioned, it's based on Node, so you need to have Node installed. And once you've got Node installed, it's as simple as installing the Gatsby command line. And you can do that just through an npm install. Once you've got the Gatsby command line installed, you can then pull down one of the many starter sites. So there are simple hello world examples, the default starter site, which we'll look at in a minute, but there are blogs and shopping carts and all sorts of various other starter sites. In order to do that, you just go Gatsby new, give it a name, and then the repo that the starter site repo that you want to pull down. I won't leave it on that. We're going to now just dive across to Visual Studio Code and have a quick look at what it looks like. Okay, so excuse me while I just switch over to code and then reshare my screen. So if I bring up VS Code, this is the Gatsby starter site. And what we can see here is the basic structure. Before we get too far into that, I'm going to just launch the Gatsby site. So by running Gatsby develop, what this does is it does all the transpilation and all of the other bits and pieces we need. And it also starts a local web server using Express. So while that's going, because that takes a few seconds, I'll take you through some of these bits and pieces. If you're familiar with a Node application, you can see here things like the package.json and JSON log. So pretty standard stuff. And you can install any of your Node packages that you want. We then have 4 configuration files. The main one is the Gatsby config. The Gatsby config specifies what plugins that we have, some metadata that's available again in the graph, and various other options. There are thousands and thousands of plugins that you can use that extend Gatsby, and they're all available on the site. The other files that we have here, I'm going to briefly touch on. So there's the server-side render file. So in here, when it actually renders those HTML files, we're able to make some adjustments. So in this case, we're setting a body attribute on every page that is rendered. And you can inject lots of different bits and pieces. The node file allows you to extend the GraphQL and add in extra data. And the browser is a set of hooks that allow you to execute code based on the actual render itself. And why this is important is because we're running all of this code at build time, you don't have access to things like the window that you typically have in an Angular app or anything like that. So you might need to execute some code on client render or on navigate or various other bits and pieces. The main bulk of the files all live in the source folder. And we can see here that we have a page per page of the application. So we can see here it's a typical React application linking off to various other React components that sit inside our components folder. So this is now running. We can see it's given us 2 URLs, a local host, which is slightly higher up, and we've got a local host, and we have a local host __ GraphQL. So if I just jump across into here, we can see this is the application running, and we can navigate around. On the GraphQL side, you actually get a navigator, so you can go through and see all of the data that you can then use to build up queries to build up your pages. The other thing that you get from this is that if we put it side by side, as we edit it, we get live reload. So as you can see there, it disappeared. So that's the end of the quick demo. We've only got 10-15 minutes here, so let's jump back into the slides. So if you want to find out more, you can go to gatsbyjs.com. There's loads of really great tutorials from never having used React all the way through to just getting started in Gatsby. You can also have a look at the Jamstack. So if you like what I've been saying today in reference to static site generators, but you're more of a view person, you can have a look at Jamstack, which is a website that talks about static site generators, and you can have a look at the other options that are out there. So thanks for listening to me. If you have any questions, you can find me at John Kilmister on Twitter, or bluebox.co.uk is my blog. Thank you.